Bohdan Stashynsky was for a few years, in the middle of the 20th century, the single most effective assassin the Soviet Union possessed, and almost no one in the world knew his name, which was exactly the point of him. He was not a large man, or a frightening one. He was slight, soft-spoken, unremarkable, the kind of man you would not look at twice on a tram or in a cafe with a clerk's tidy manner and mild eyes. He spoke several languages well enough to pass. He could sit across from you in a Munich beer hall and be entirely forgotten the moment you turned your head. That ordinariness was not incidental to his work. It was his work. A killer who is noticed is a failed killer, and Bohdan Stashynsky was never noticed because there was nothing about him to notice. A plain young man from a Ukrainian village, carrying a rolled-up newspaper, moving through the crowds of a West German city with the two most perfect murders of the Cold War hidden inside him. He killed with a weapon that left no wound. That is the first thing to understand about him. The thing that made him so valuable and so terrible. He did not shoot his victims, or stab them, or strangle them. He walked up to them in the ordinary course of an ordinary day, and he sprayed a fine mist of poison into their faces, and they fell down and died, and the doctors who examined the bodies wrote the same word each time: natural, heart failure. A man in his prime, dead on a staircase with no mark on him, no blood, no bruise, no trace of any human hand, because the poison that killed him was designed to vanish from the body almost as fast as it stopped the heart. Bohdan Stashynsky did not merely commit murders. He committed murders that did not look like murders at all, and for years the men he killed went into the ground as victims of nothing but their own hearts. And here's the paradox at the center of this story, the thing that makes it worth telling, the most untraceable killer the Soviets ever produced. The one man whose crimes left no evidence, no witness, no proof of any kind, became in the end the evidence himself. He walked into the light of his own free will and told the world everything: how he was chosen, how he was trained, how the weapon worked, who gave the orders, and where the orders came from, all the way to the top. The perfect assassin, whose entire value was that he could not be connected to anything, connected himself to all of it out loud in a courtroom in front of the world's press. And in doing so, he did more damage to the Soviet security state than any spy or defector of his generation. To understand how that happened, how a state's deadliest instrument turned in its own hand, you have to go back to a train and a boy who had done nothing more terrible at first than ride it without a ticket. Bohdan Stashynsky was born in 1931 in a small village in the hills of western Ukraine, near the city of Lviv, into a world that was about to be ground to powder between two empires. His was a Ukrainian peasant family, poor and pious, and quietly patriotic in the way of that region, where the dream of an independent Ukraine was not an abstraction, but a thing men had died for within living memory. Western Ukraine in those years was a land passed hand to hand by force, Polish, then Soviet, then Nazi, then Soviet again, and through all of it ran the Ukrainian nationalist underground, the OUN and its fighters, waging a hopeless guerrilla war against whoever held the land, dreaming of a country that never came. Bohdan's own family leaned that way. His sisters had ties to the movement. He grew up in a house where the Soviet state was the enemy, and the men in the forest with their rifles were the heroes, and none of that would have made him remarkable, because it described half the families in those hills. It is worth stopping on that world for a moment, because it made the man. Western Ukraine in Bohdan's boyhood was one of the most violently contested places on earth. In the space of a few years, it was ruled by Poland, then seized by Stalin under the pact with Hitler, then overrun by the Nazi invasion, then reconquered by the Red Army, each turnover bringing its own arrests, deportations, massacres, and mass graves. Through all of it, the Ukrainian insurgent army fought on from the forests, a guerrilla war against the returning Soviets that ground on into the 1950s, long after the wider war was over, a hopeless and ferocious resistance that the Soviet security organs answered with everything they had. Whole villages were watched, informed upon, emptied. To be a young Ukrainian in those hills was to grow up amid an undeclared war between the underground and the secret police, in which the deadliest weapon on the state's side was not the rifle but the informer, the neighbor, the classmate, the cousin who reported. Bohdan grew up soaked in the nationalist sympathy of that world without ever quite choosing it, the way a child absorbs the weather. He knew men who had gone to the forest. His sisters moved in circles that touched the movement. Had history left him alone, he would very likely have become a school teacher with quiet, unspoken loyalties, one of the millions who kept their heads down and their opinions private and survived. But history did not leave that region alone, and it did not leave Bohdan alone. And the same secret police who were strangling the underground were always hunting for the next frightened young person they could turn against it. He was a bright boy, bright enough for university, and he went to study to be a teacher in Lviv, and it was there on an ordinary day around 1950 that his whole life was decided by something almost comically small. He was riding a train home without a ticket, a trivial thing, a poor student saving a few kopecks, and he was caught. And the railway police who caught him were not, as it happened, only railway police. They handed him, or he came to the attention of, the MGB, the Soviet secret police, the organization that would soon be renamed the KGB. And the officers of that organization looked at this frightened student with nationalist sisters and a fare-dodging charge, and they saw not a petty offender, but an opportunity. This is how the machine worked, and it is important to understand it because it is the key to everything Bohdan Stashynsky became. The Soviet security state did not, on the whole, recruit its instruments from among true believers. It manufactured them out of ordinary, frightened, compromised people by finding the crack in a life and driving a wedge into it. They told young Bohdan the truth of his situation, which was that they could destroy him, expel him from the university, ruin his future, and, far worse, turn their attention to his family and the nationalist ties they could prove. Or, they said, he could be useful. He could inform, he could report on the very underground his own family touched, and in exchange his transgression would be forgotten and his people would be left alone. He was 19. He was terrified. He told himself it was temporary, that he would give them little, that he could protect the people who mattered. Every compromised man tells himself some version of this, and it is almost never true. Bohdan Stashynsky agreed to inform, and in that moment, riding home from a train he hadn't paid for, an ordinary Ukrainian student stepped onto the first stair of a staircase that would end with 2 men dead in Munich and his own name on the lips of the world. He was a good informant, which was the worst thing that could have happened to him. The underground he was sent to betray was not an abstraction. It was made of real people, some of them known to him, some connected to his own family. Men and women hiding in the forests and safe houses of Western Ukraine, hunted by the state Bohdan now served. He gave them up, slowly at first, then more, his reports feeding the security organs' war against the insurgency, and at least one of the operations his information enabled ended in the deaths of the people it targeted. He was, in the plainest terms, betraying his own, his neighbors, his people's cause, in some cases men who trusted him. And he was good at it, thorough and observant and reliable, and the more useful he proved, the deeper the state buried its hook. There was no getting out. That was the design. Once he had informed, once his hands were dirty, the nationalist underground would have killed him as a traitor if they ever learned what he'd done, which meant his only protection in the world was the very organization that had turned him. The KGB had made him theirs by making him unsafe everywhere else. His family, learning or sensing what he'd become, turned cold. The movement he'd been raised to love would have shot him on sight, and the only door left open in his whole life was the one marked with the state's red star. So he walked through it. He stopped being a student. He became formally an agent of Soviet intelligence, and his masters, having tested him and found him obedient and capable, and, this was the crucial quality, thoroughly compromised, decided he was worth developing into something more than an informant. What did that betrayal cost him in the years before anyone ever handed him a weapon? It is easy from a distance to skip past the informer stage as a kind of prologue, a small sin on the way to the large ones. But it was not small to the people it touched, and it was not small to him. Every report he wrote was a face. There was a young man he had known, connected to the movement, whom he watched and reported on, and who was taken. There were meetings he described, couriers he identified, safe houses he marked, and somewhere at the end of that paperwork were arrests and interrogations, and, in at least one case, graves. Bohdan did this not with a gun in a stairwell, but with a pen in a quiet room, which is in some ways the more corrosive way to kill, because it lets a man tell himself he is only reporting, only observing, only doing what he was told, while the consequences happen elsewhere, out of sight to people whose trust he had kept just long enough to sell. He learned in those years the central lesson the state wanted him to learn, that he could do terrible things and feel almost nothing at the moment of doing them, because the moment of doing them was only a conversation, only a signature, only a name spoken quietly to a man in a gray coat. By the time they decided to make him a killer, they were not starting from scratch. They were finishing something they had begun on a train. They took him to be trained. They cleaned him up, taught him tradecraft, drilled him in German, gave him the polish and the paperwork of a man who could move through the West. They gave him new names and new histories to wear like coats. At various times he was Josef Lehmann or Siegfried Draeger, ordinary German identities built for a young man with no accent to give him away. They were building an illegal in the language of the trade, an agent with no diplomatic cover, no embassy to run to, no protection if caught, living entirely inside a false life in enemy territory. It is the loneliest and most dangerous role in all of espionage, and they were grooming their quiet Ukrainian for it. And Bohdan Stashynsky, with nowhere else in the world to go, let them. And what does it do to a man to be trained into a false self so completely? Consider what they were actually asking of him. They were teaching him to be no one, to answer to a name that was not his, to remember a childhood that had never happened, to have opinions and habits and a way of ordering coffee that belonged to a German who did not exist. An illegal does not merely carry false papers. He carries a false soul, worn so long and so consistently that the true one begins to fade underneath it. Bohdan learned to introduce himself as Joseph Lehmann without a flicker. He learned to think in German, to dream eventually in the cover story. He crossed borders on documents that lied about everything, sat in cafes in cities where a single slip of the tongue could end him, and went to sleep in rented rooms as a man with no past he could speak of and no future he could name. There was no one in the world to whom he could be Bohdan. Not a friend, not a family, not a single soul who knew where he came from or what he truly was. The state had made him unsafe among his own people, and then hollowed out even the private self he might have kept for comfort. He was, in the most literal sense, alone inside his own life. And the only cure the organization offered for that loneliness was more work, more obedience, deeper submersion into the lie. A man kept that isolated will eventually cling to the first real thing that reaches him. The KGB should have understood that. It was the flaw they built into their own perfect weapon. And then, when he was ready, they told him what they actually wanted him for. They did not want him to gather secrets. They wanted him to kill. The weapon they eventually placed in his hands was a marvel of murderous engineering, and it is worth pausing on because it explains how a slight young man could kill powerful, guarded enemies of the Soviet state and leave nothing behind. It looked like nothing. It was a small metal tube rolled inside a newspaper so that it read at a glance as a man carrying his morning paper. Inside the tube was a crushed glass ampule of poison, prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide, and a firing mechanism. When the assassin pressed a trigger, a small charge crushed the ampule and fired a fine mist of the poison forward, a cloud of it at close range into the face of the target. The victim breathed it in. Within seconds, the cyanide stopped the heart, and the man collapsed as though struck down by a sudden cardiac arrest. And here was the genius and the horror of it. Cyanide, delivered this way, metabolizes and dissipates fast. By the time a body was found and examined, the poison had largely faded from the tissues, and there was no wound, no puncture, no foreign object, nothing for a coroner to find. The cause of death read again and again as natural heart failure. A tragedy, but no crime. There was one problem. The poison did not care whether the man breathing it was the target or the assassin, so the KGB's chemists gave Bohdan a defense. Before a killing, he was to swallow a protective tablet and, at the moment of the act, crush a small capsule of antidote and inhale it himself, a countermeasure to shield him from the very cloud he was firing. It was crude and frightening and only partly reliable, and it meant that every murder Bohdan Stashynsky committed, he committed with a lungful of the same death he was dealing, trusting a pill to keep it from taking him too. The weapon had not appeared by accident. Somewhere in the Soviet security apparatus was a laboratory whose entire purpose was the quiet killing of human beings. A place where chemists and technicians refined the art of murder as though it were any other branch of engineering. How to deliver a lethal dose in a fraction of a second. How to make that dose disappear from the tissues before a coroner's knife could find it. How to protect the operator so that the tool did not destroy the hand that held it. Bohdan was sent to be instructed in the device by the people who had made it, and he practiced. He practiced the draw, the way the newspaper had to sit in the hand so that the tube inside pointed true, the timing of the protective tablet, the crush of the antidote capsule at the instant of firing. They tested the weapon, some accounts say, on a dog so that their assassin could see with his own eyes how fast the animal dropped and how completely the poison vanished. He watched a living thing die in seconds from a mist he could barely see, and he understood exactly what he would soon do to a man. He did not, by his own later account, want to do it. But wanting was not a category the training recognized. The training recognized only competence, and Bohdan, as he had been at everything the state asked of him, was competent. He learned the gun the way he had learned German, thoroughly, obediently, and with a growing private dread. He told no one, because there was no one to tell. He did not want to do it. This is one of the things he would later swear to, and there is reason to believe it. He was not a killer by temperament. He was a frightened, obedient young man who had been assembled into a killer by a state that specialized in exactly that assembly. But wanting had nothing to do with it. He had no exit, no protection, no life outside the organization, and the organization had decided what he was for. They gave him his first target, and they sent him to Munich, the city where the exiled leadership of Ukrainian nationalism had gathered to keep their impossible dream alive from the safety of the West. They meant to reach into that safety through Bohdan's hands and prove that there was no safety anywhere from the long arm of the Soviet state. Munich in those years was, in the secret geography of the Cold War, a Ukrainian city as much as a German one. The defeat of the nationalist dream at home had scattered its leaders and thinkers and fighters westward, and many of them had washed up in the American zone of southern Germany, in Munich, above all, where they rebuilt the movement in exile. Newspapers, political committees, radio broadcasts, congresses held in rented halls, a whole shadow nation carrying on the argument for an independent Ukraine from the far side of the Iron Curtain. To the men who ran it, this émigré world was the keeping of a sacred flame. To Moscow, it was an open wound, a nest of the most committed enemies the Soviet state possessed, broadcasting and publishing and organizing where the KGB could not simply arrest them. The Kremlin had spent the post-war years watching this exile leadership with fury, and it had concluded that the ordinary tools, infiltration, propaganda, the turning of informers, were not enough. It wanted the leaders themselves removed, and it wanted the removals to be invisible so that the movement would be decapitated without Moscow's fingerprints anywhere near the bodies. That was the strategy into which Bohdan Stashynsky and his silent weapon fit like a key into a lock. He was not being sent to gather intelligence on the émigrés. He was being sent to kill their best men, one at a time, and to make each death look like the ordinary failure of a human heart. The first man they sent him to kill was Rebet. Rebet was a Ukrainian émigré, a journalist, a political thinker, a leading voice of the nationalist movement in exile. One of those men who kept the cause alive in the newspapers and meeting halls of West Germany. A thorn in Moscow's side, not because he carried a gun, but because he carried an idea. He lived and worked in Munich, unguarded, a middle-aged intellectual, going about the ordinary business of a man in exile. And he had no reason on earth to fear the mild-looking stranger who had been studying his movements for weeks. The stalking of a man is a strangely intimate thing, and Bohdan did it with the patience the state had trained into him. He came to Munich as one more anonymous face in a city full of them, and he watched. He learned the hours Rebet kept, the tram he took, the doorway he used, the newspaper kiosk he passed, the stairwell he climbed each day to the offices where the émigré press did its work. He walked the route himself, more than once, timing it, marking where the crowds thinned, and where a man might be alone for the few seconds the weapon needed. He passed close to Rebet on at least one occasion before the killing, close enough to do it, and did not. Whether because the moment was wrong or because something in him hesitated, no one can now say. There is something almost unbearable in that picture. The assassin and his victim brushing past each other on an ordinary Munich morning, one of them going about the small business of a life, the other carrying that life's ending rolled up in a newspaper, waiting for the geometry to be perfect. Bohdan waited. He was good at waiting. It was most of what the work was. And when the day came that the stairwell was empty and the timing was clean, he stopped waiting. Bohdan learned him the way a hunter learns prey. Where he lived, where he worked, the route he walked, the times he walked it, the staircase he climbed to his office. And on a day in the autumn of 1957, in the stairwell of an office building on a Munich street, Bohdan Stashynsky did the thing he had been built to do. He had swallowed his protective tablet. He carried the rolled newspaper with the tube inside it. He passed Lev Rebet on the stairs, close, face to face for an instant, and he raised the paper and pressed the trigger and fired the mist of cyanide directly into the older man's face. Rebet took a few more steps, then his heart stopped and he fell, and he died there on the staircase, and Bohdan walked out of the building and away into the ordinary morning and was gone. He disposed of the weapon in a canal. He left Munich. There was no chase because no one knew there was anything to chase. When they found Lev Rebet's body, the doctors examined him and found a healthy-looking man dead of sudden heart failure, and that is what they wrote, and that is what the world believed. A nationalist leader had died of natural causes. It was sad. It was not suspicious. It was to everyone but the man who had done it and the men who had ordered it, simply the way the human heart sometimes fails. The perfect murder. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, an actual, literal, perfect murder, a killing that the entire machinery of Western law enforcement examined and ruled was not a killing at all. Bohdan Stashynsky had erased a man from the world and left the world convinced no crime had occurred. And when he reported back, his masters were very, very pleased because he had just proven that their weapon worked, that their assassin worked, that they could kill their enemies in the heart of the West, and no one would ever know. They gave him a little time. And then they gave him a bigger target. But the time in between was not empty. And it is in that interval that the first hairline crack in the perfect weapon can be seen if you look for it. Bohdan went back to his handlers, back to his false life, back to Inga in the East, and he carried inside him now something he had not carried before, the memory of a man's face at the instant the poison reached it, the few staggering steps, the fall. He had killed with a pen for years and felt little. Killing with his hands, at arm's length, watching it happen, was not the same. However clean the method, however natural the doctors ruled it, he told himself the things the state had taught him to tell himself, that Rebet was an enemy, that this was war, that soldiers kill and are not murderers. But he was not a soldier, and Rebet had not been armed, and there had been no battle. Only a quiet stairwell and a mild morning, and a defenseless middle-aged man who wrote articles for a cause. Somewhere under the discipline, Bohdan knew the difference, and the knowing did not go away. It sat in him through the months that followed, small and patient, the way his own waiting had been patient, and it was still there when his masters, pleased with their proof of concept, decided their assassin was ready for the target that mattered most of all. So, the bigger target was the biggest of all. It was Stepan Bandera. To understand what Bandera meant, you have to understand what he was to both sides. To many Ukrainian nationalists, he was the symbol of the whole struggle, the most famous leader of the OUN, a name that meant the dream of an independent Ukraine itself, a figure so central that his followers were called simply Banderites. To Moscow, he was the arch-enemy, the living embodiment of the nationalism the Soviet state had spent decades and rivers of blood trying to crush. A man whose continued existence in the safety of Munich was an affront the Kremlin could not tolerate. He was also, unlike Rebet, aware of the danger. Bandera knew the Soviets wanted him dead. He lived under a degree of guard and false identity, careful, hunted, a man who had survived on his wariness for years. None of it was enough against a weapon that left no wound and an assassin no one could see coming. Bohdan studied Bandera the way he had studied Rebet, only harder, because the target was harder. The guarded routines, the false name, the careful life. He found the seams. He learned the building on Kreitmeierstrasse where Bandera lived under an assumed identity, learned his comings and goings, waited for his moment. And on the 15th of October, 1959, that moment came. Bandera returned home. There was a difficulty with the door, and in the entryway of the building, Bohdan Stashynsky stepped close to the most wanted man in the Ukrainian world, raised the rolled newspaper, and fired the poison into his face. But this time, it did not pass unnoticed. Bandera was found dying on the stairs, and though the first assumption was again heart failure, there were suspicions from the start. The man had known he was a target. Cyanide traces were detected, and the death was investigated as a possible poisoning, even as no one could prove how or by whom. The perfect murder was a shade less perfect the second time. Still, no arrest came. No one connected the killing to a quiet young man with false papers who had already left the country. Stepan Bandera, who had survived the Nazis and the Soviets and decades of exile, was dead, and the man who had killed him melted back into the anonymity that was his only real disguise, and the case went cold. In Moscow, they were triumphant. Bohdan Stashynsky had eliminated the single most important enemy of the Soviet state in the immigration, and he had done it with the poison gun, and he had gotten away clean. He was summoned to the Soviet capital, and there, in a ceremony that tells you everything about the world he had entered, the head of the KGB himself, Alexander Stepan, one of the most powerful men in the Soviet Union, personally presented Bohdan Stashynsky with the Order of the Red Banner, one of the state's high military decorations, for the murder of Stepan Bandera. They pinned a medal on the chest of their assassin and promised him a bright future in the organization, a career, a place among the elite of Soviet intelligence. He had reached the summit of what a man in his position could reach. He was the state's perfect weapon, decorated by its highest hand. And it was at exactly this moment, at the very peak, that Bohdan Stashynsky began to fall. Because somewhere in the middle of becoming the KGB's greatest assassin, he had fallen in love. Her name was Inga Pol, and she was an East German woman. And she was, without ever firing a shot or passing a secret, the most dangerous thing that ever happened to the Soviet assassination program. Bohdan had met her in East Berlin during the long stretches of his work there, an ordinary young German woman living an ordinary life, and he had fallen for her the way lonely men in false lives fall, completely, gratefully, hungrily, because she was real, and almost nothing else in his life was. With Inga, he was not Josef Lehmann or Siegfried Draeger or agent this or agent that. With Inga, he was, or could imagine being, simply Bohdan, a man who might have a normal life, a wife, a home, a future measured in something other than targets. He wanted her. He wanted the ordinary human life she represented. And that want, that entirely human and unremarkable want, was the crack that would bring the whole edifice down. Because the KGB did not like it. An illegal, an assassin carrying the state's deadliest secrets, does not simply marry a Western woman of his own choosing. The organization distrusted the relationship from the start. Distrusted Inga, distrusted the pull she had on their man, distrusted anything that gave their instrument a loyalty outside themselves. They pressured him. They wanted him to bring her into their world or leave her. They wanted the couple to relocate to Moscow, where Bohdan could be watched and managed, and where Inge's Western sympathies could be contained. And Inge, for her part, was no friend of the system. She was anti-communist in her bones, and as she came to understand, or to sense, what her husband truly was and what he had truly done, she did not celebrate it. She recoiled from it, and she began, quietly, to pull him toward the light. This is the human hinge of the whole story, and it deserves to be seen plainly. Bohdan Stashynsky had committed 2 murders for the Soviet state and the state's own doctrine. The ideology, the discipline, the fear had been enough to make him do it. What the ideology could not survive was love. Sitting with a woman who looked at what he was with horror instead of pride, a woman who wanted an ordinary life and a clean one. Bohdan began for the first time to see himself through eyes that were not the KGB's. He began to understand that he was not a soldier or a hero, but a murderer, that the men he had killed were human beings with lives and ideas, that the medal on his chest was pinned there for the crime of ending them. The conscience that the state had spent years training out of him came back, and it came back because a woman he loved would not let him look away. They married, and the marriage, which should have been the beginning of a life, became instead the beginning of the end. Because now the KGB had a decorated assassin whose loyalty was visibly divided, and the KGB did not tolerate divided loyalty in men who knew what Bohdan knew. Then their child died, and the last thread holding Bohdan Stashynsky to the Soviet state snapped. The couple had a baby son, born into their watched and precarious life, and the infant died in the summer of 1961, only a few months old. It was a private grief of the most crushing kind, and it happened inside a cage because the KGB, by now, trusted Bohdan so little that even his mourning was a security problem to be managed. They controlled where he could go, what he could do, how he could grieve. They permitted the couple to travel to East Berlin for the child's funeral, but under surveillance, watched, escorted, their sorrow itself a thing the organization stage managed to keep its assassin in hand. Some accounts hold that the very circumstances of the child's death and the KGB's cold handling of it deepened the couple's certainty that they were prisoners, not agents, that the state which had made Bohdan a killer now regarded him and his wife as objects to be controlled and would never let them go, and would dispose of them the moment they became more danger than they were worth. Bohdan understood his position with terrible clarity. He knew too much. He was the poison gun made flesh, the living proof of 2 state murders and the whole apparatus behind them. A man like that is not retired. A man like that is eliminated sooner or later when his usefulness is spent and his reliability in question. And Bohdan's reliability was very much in question now. He could see the arithmetic. If he stayed, he and Inge would live and die inside the cage, watched and used, until the day the organization decided they were a loose end and closed them out the way Bohdan had closed out Rebet and Bandera. There was no future in obedience. There was only a slower death. And so, standing in East Berlin in August of 1961, grieving his son and watching his handlers watch him, Bohdan Stashynsky made the decision that turned the perfect assassin into the state's worst catastrophe. He decided to run, to take Inge, and cross to the west and give himself up, to confess everything, to trade the deadly secrets in his head for the only 2 things he had left to want, his life and some fragment of a clean conscience. The timing was almost unimaginably narrow, and it is one of those places where history turns on ours. Because in that same August of 1961, the Soviet and East German authorities were about to seal the border. On the night of August 12th into the 13th, the Berlin Wall went up, the barbed wire, and then the concrete that would trap East Berliners for a generation and slam shut the last easy crossing between the Soviet world and the free one. Bohdan and Inge fled across just before it closed. A day or 2 later, and the wall would have stood between them and the West forever, and Bohdan Stashynsky would have remained the KGB's secret, and Rebet and Bandera would have stayed, in the eyes of the world, 2 men who died of nothing but bad hearts. Instead, in the last hours before the door shut, the assassin and his wife slipped through it and went to the Americans, and Bohdan began to talk. What he told them detonated slowly, and then all at once. At first, the West could hardly believe him. Here was a slight, mild young man calmly confessing to 2 murders that Western authorities had officially ruled were not murders at all, insisting that Lev Rebet and Stepan Bandera, both certified dead of natural causes, had in fact been assassinated by him personally on the direct orders of the KGB with a secret poison weapon that left no trace. It sounded like fantasy, or like a man seeking attention. But Bohdan did not sound like a fantasist. He was precise. He knew things only the killer could know. The details of the weapon, the movements of the victims, the mechanics of the poison, the chain of command that ran from his hand all the way up to the leadership of the KGB. He led investigators to re-examine the deaths. He described the untraceable method that explained why the crimes had looked like heart attacks. Piece by piece, the impossible confession checked out, and the West realized what had fallen into its lap. Not a crank, but the actual, literal instrument of Soviet state murder, offering to lay the entire program bare. In 1962, they put him on trial in Karlsruhe, in West Germany, and the trial became one of the great spectacles of the Cold War. But it was a strange trial, because in the dock technically sat Bohdan Stashynsky, the confessed killer of two men, while in every way that mattered, the defendant was the Soviet Union itself. Bohdan told the court everything openly, how he had been trapped and recruited, how he had been trained and armed, how he had killed Rebet and then Bandera, how Stepan himself had pinned the medal on his chest. The world's press carried it all. The most secretive security service on Earth had its most secret operation narrated aloud, in detail, by the man who had carried it out in a Western courtroom for the record of history. It was a propaganda disaster for Moscow beyond anything a mere defector could have caused. Because this was not an analyst describing documents. This was the assassin describing the murders, with the medal to prove who had ordered them. And then the court did something remarkable. Something that goes to the very heart of what this story is about. It considered the question of Bohdan Stashynsky's guilt, and it decided that while he had certainly committed the killings, he was not, in the fullest sense, the murderer. The murderer, the court effectively found, was the state that had manufactured him, the Soviet system that had taken a frightened student and, through blackmail and training and the removal of every other choice, built him into a weapon and pointed him and pulled the trigger through him. Bohdan was judged an accomplice to murders whose true author was the government that ordered them. He was convicted, but he was sentenced with astonishing leniency for a double killer. 8 years in prison. The message of the verdict rang out across the world. The man in the dock was a tool. The guilt belonged to the hand that had wielded him, and that hand was in Moscow. He served about 4 years, and then Bohdan Stashynsky walked out of prison and out of history, and no one has been able to say for certain what became of him. Released in the mid-1960s, he was a man with the most dangerous biography imaginable and a target on his back for the rest of his life. He had betrayed the KGB more completely than almost anyone ever had, exposed its methods and its crimes, and its command in open court, humiliated the Soviet state before the world. The organization does not forget such things. So the West did for him the only thing it could. It made him disappear. He was given a new identity, a new face by some accounts, a new life somewhere far from Europe. South Africa is the country most often named, though even that is uncertain. Inc and the marriage did not survive the wreckage. That much seems clear. And after that, the trail simply goes cold. There are rumors, claimed sightings, unconfirmed reports of an old man living quietly under another name in another hemisphere. There is no reliable account of his death. The perfect assassin, who spent his career being no one, ended it by becoming no one again, this time for good. And that is where the two ways of seeing him live, because the world has never been able to agree on what Bohdan Stashynsky actually was. In one telling, he was a murderer, plain and simple. A man who killed two human beings in cold blood, who studied them and stalked them and sprayed poison into their faces and walked away, and who confessed in the end not out of any real conscience, but out of pure self-preservation, when he could see that his masters were done with him. In this reading, his remorse was convenient. His conscience arrived exactly when it served his survival, and the leniency of the court was a Cold War bargain that let a double killer off with a few years because his testimony was useful. Lev Rebet and Stepan Bandera were just as dead, whatever was in the heart of the man who killed them, and no love story and no verdict changes that two men went into the ground so that a nation's secret police could send a message. In the other telling, Bohdan Stashynsky was himself a kind of victim, the most chilling proof ever offered of how a modern state can take an ordinary, frightened young man and manufacture him into a weapon, stripping away his choices one at a time until murder is the only door left open, and then discarding him when he is spent. In this reading, his real crime was committed at 19, on a train, when he let fear make him an informer, and everything after was the machine, closing around a boy who never found the moment to say no until a woman he loved gave him the courage to say it. His confession, in this telling, was the single free and human act of his adult life. The moment the weapon turned in the state's hand and pointed back at the men who had forged it, and told the truth, and accepted the judgment of the world. The court chose the second reading. History has never fully settled between them, and perhaps it cannot, because both are true at once. He was the murderer, and he was the manufactured man. He fired the poison, and he was the poison someone else had made. And the deepest irony of all is the one this whole story turns on, that the Soviet state built the perfect assassin precisely so that its crimes could never be traced to it, and that in doing so, it created the one witness who could trace every one of them, straight to the top, and who, in the end, chose to. They wanted a man who would leave no evidence behind. They got a man who became the evidence. And two émigré leaders who died, the world was told, of nothing but their own failing hearts, were finally known to have been murdered, because the murderer himself refused at last to let the lie stand. If a story like this one stays with you, stay with us. The most dangerous secret a state can keep is the man it trained to keep it.